I'd like to preface this by saying that I live a pretty straight-laced lifestyle, no drinking, no drugs, so I'm absolutely certain that what I saw and heard on the night of December 30th wasn't some hallucination or drunken stupor. It was real. I live on the outskirts of a small town in western Kentucky, where a few of my friends live even farther out in the rural backcountry. One of my friends, Greg, lives with his family in one of the wealthier neighborhoods nestled deep in the woods. Every year, his family throws a big end-of-year party, inviting friends and relatives. I'm always on the guest list, and it's an event I look forward to. The weather had been unseasonably warm until a sudden cold front swept through right before the party. That evening, I made the drive along the winding, unlit back roads to Greg's house. Normally, I avoid using my brights because I find them obnoxious when others do it, but on this pitch-black road, they were necessary. The road was surrounded by dense woods, making it hard to anticipate sharp turns, even with the high beams on. There were no houses along the stretch except for an old, dilapidated cabin that seemed long abandoned. Occasionally, though, I'd catch a faint flicker of light through the windows as I drove past. About halfway there, on a straight section of the road, my headlights illuminated something ahead, a pale figure standing by the trees. As I got closer, it became clear it was a woman in a thin white dress, utterly unsuitable for the freezing temperatures. She stood motionless, her back to the woods, facing the road. I kept my brights on, trying to discern details, but the glare off her dress made it impossible. As I passed her, I felt a pang of unease. Should I stop? What if she needed help? But when I glanced in my rearview mirror, my blood ran cold. The woman had turned to face my car, still rooted in place, her gaze following me. I arrived at Greg's party at 8:30 p.m., rattled but determined to brush it off. The evening was lively. Food, music, and laughter filled the house. We counted down the New Year's Eve ball drop in New York, though it was only the 30th, and celebrated until midnight. By the time I left, it was nearly 1:30 a.m., and my car was the only one left in the driveway. When I started the engine, a tire pressure warning light came on. My car doesn't indicate which tire is low, so I assumed the cold weather had affected the pressure. Figuring I'd make it home, I pulled back onto the same road I'd driven in on. That's when I thought about the woman. Was she still out there? There was another route I could have taken home, but it would have added 30 minutes to my drive. Reluctantly, I decided to take the shortcut. Barely 5 minutes into the drive, my car began to wobble. Then came a loud scraping noise, and the vehicle slowed to a dead stop. My stomach dropped. I pulled over and reluctantly stepped out with my phone's flashlight. What I saw made my blood freeze. All 4 tires were shredded, as if slashed by some enormous claw. My mind raced. Could this have been sabotage? Then everything went silent. The wind stopped, the trees stilled, and even the nocturnal chirps of crickets and owls ceased. A twig snapped. I turned off my flashlight, plunging myself into darkness. The sound of leaves crunching grew louder, deliberate and slow. My heart pounded. Was it an animal? A person? Then I heard her voice. "I see you." It was soft, calm, almost playful and absolutely chilling. "Can you see me? B." I flicked my flashlight back on, my hands trembling. I aimed it toward the trees. There she was. The woman stood at the tree line, her pale face illuminated in the beam. Her dress was filthy, stained with mud and something darker. Her gray hair hung in wild tangles, and her face, oh God, her face. Half of her jaw was missing, leaving a grotesque, gaping wound that somehow twisted into a semblance of a grin. I bolted. Adrenaline propelled me down the dark road, back toward Greg's house. I could hear her behind me, twigs snapping, leaves crunching, but I didn't dare look back. Somehow I made it to the front door, pounding on it until Greg's mother let me in. I stumbled inside, breathless, and explained what happened. Greg and his parents were horrified. They let me stay the night and called the police. I collapsed onto the guest bed, exhausted but unable to sleep. At 3:14 a.m., I heard a soft tapping on the window. I froze. Then came the voice again. "I see you." She was outside, throwing pebbles at the glass. I stayed motionless until the first light of dawn. When Greg's parents checked the yard, they found a rusty knife near the spot where I'd heard her voice. The police searched the old cabin I mentioned earlier. They found no one, but the surrounding woods were littered with dead animals, gutted and left to rot. The woman was never found. This year, I'll still go to Greg's end-of-year party, but I'm carpooling and I'm taking the long way. When I was 27, I decided to visit a close friend who had recently moved to Austin, Texas. It was a quick trip, just a long weekend, but enough to catch up and enjoy some much-needed time away. My return flight to Chicago was a late one, scheduled to land just after midnight. By the time the plane touched down, and I made it through the terminal to the ground transportation pickup area, it was about 12:30 a.m. I was exhausted and in no mood to wait for an Uber, so I decided to flag down a taxi instead. A yellow minivan pulled up to the curb, and I gave the driver my apartment address. He quoted me $35 for the ride, which sounded reasonable, so I agreed. The driver, a man in his 40s or so, stepped out and offered to load my bag into the trunk. I politely declined, saying I preferred to keep it with me. He shrugged and placed the bag on the seat to my left, right behind him. I slid into the seat diagonal from him, trying to keep some distance. He climbed back into the driver's seat, pulled up my address on his GPS, and we were on our way. The drive home was about 25 minutes with no traffic, and at this hour the streets were nearly deserted. I leaned back, hoping to relax a bit, but it wasn't long before the unease began to creep in. I caught him glancing at me in the rearview mirror. The first time, I brushed it off as nothing. The second time, though, his stare lingered long enough to make me uncomfortable. He finally broke the silence. "So, where are you coming from?" he asked. "Austin," I replied simply. "I was visiting a friend." "Ah, very nice," he said, his tone overly familiar. Then, without missing a beat, he added, "Is your friend as pretty as you?" I froze for a moment, unsure how to respond. The comment was far too forward and inappropriate, especially given how little we'd spoken. I gave a polite laugh, hoping to deflect, but I could feel my skin crawl. From there, his questions didn't let up. "What's a beautiful girl like you doing traveling alone at this hour?" he asked. I answered, "Well, I wasn't alone. I was visiting a friend." He smirked. "But flying alone counts as traveling alone, doesn't it?" I kept my tone light but firm. "We can agree to disagree," I said, hoping to shut him down. He laughed like he thought he was being charming, but it only made me feel more uneasy. Something about the situation felt off. His overly personal questions and the way he kept looking at me through the mirror made my instincts scream that this wasn't normal. We continued down the highway, and I tried to focus on the passing scenery, hoping the ride would end soon. But as we neared my exit, I noticed he wasn't slowing down. "This is my exit," I said, leaning forward slightly. He didn't acknowledge me and sped right past it. "Hey, that was my exit," I said again, louder this time. "Oh, sorry about that," he said casually. "I'll catch the next one." I tried to glance at the GPS on his phone to see if he had entered the right address, but the screen was angled away from me. My stomach churned. Something wasn't right. When the next exit approached, I said, much firmer this time, "Get off here." He finally turned on his blinker and merged off the highway. I noticed him glance at me in the mirror again, and this time his expression seemed different, almost annoyed. I shifted in my seat, my anxiety mounting. Then he asked, "Do you have a boyfriend?" I didn't hesitate. "Yes, I do," I said quickly. "He's waiting for me at home." He glanced at me again, his eyes narrowing slightly. "What's his name?" he asked. I stared at him in disbelief. Was he seriously asking me that? My instincts went into overdrive. I reached into my bag, pulled out my headphones, and put them on. They were nearly dead, but I didn't care. I needed a barrier between us. I texted my family and a couple of close friends, explaining the situation and sharing my location. I wanted someone to know where I was in case things went south. We were back in familiar territory now, close to my neighborhood. As we approached a red light, I felt his eyes on me again. I glanced up and saw him staring at me in the mirror, his expression dark and unsettling. My heart pounded. The light turned green, but he didn't move. I had to tell him, "It's green," before he started driving again. At the next light, I spotted a police car parked in an empty lot just ahead. A rush of relief washed over me. As soon as the taxi came to a stop, I grabbed my bag, threw open the door, and bolted. "What are you doing?" the driver yelled after me. He tried to close the door using the power button, but I forced it open and jumped out. I sprinted toward the police car, waving my arms frantically. The officer rolled down his window, looking startled. "What's going on?" he asked. I quickly explained that the taxi driver had been acting suspiciously and making me feel unsafe. I asked if he could give me a ride home, and thankfully, he agreed. As the officer drove me the short distance to my apartment, I couldn't stop thinking about how the driver hadn't tried to stop me or come after me for the fare. That alone was a huge red flag. When I finally got home, I locked the door behind me, brushed my teeth, and collapsed into bed. I was still rattled but grateful to be safe. Just as I was drifting off, I heard a knock at my front door. My heart froze. The knocking was persistent, then stopped, only to start again a few minutes later. I stayed in my room, too scared to move. The door was locked, and that was all that mattered. Eventually, the knocking stopped, and I drifted into a fitful sleep. The next day, I got a call from my neighbor, Eric. He said he'd seen someone peering into my windows early that morning. He thought it might have been my dad. I immediately called my dad, but he said he hadn't been anywhere near my apartment. My stomach dropped. I told him everything about the taxi driver, and he insisted I come stay with him for a few days. That evening, while packing my things, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. My apartment felt different off. I started hearing faint creaks in the floorboards, like the sound of someone shifting their weight. I told myself I was being paranoid, but I couldn't ignore the feeling. As I grabbed my bag and headed for the door, I heard a low creak from the spare bedroom. My blood ran cold. I turned just in time to see an arm swing into the hallway. A voice called out, "I wasn't going to hurt you." I didn't wait to see who it was. I bolted out the front door, screaming for help. My neighbors, Eric and his wife, rushed outside. Instead of going back in, we called 911 and waited for the police to arrive. The officers searched my apartment and found the back sliding door open. Whoever had been inside was gone. I packed up my things and went to stay with my parents for a week. Since then, I've moved twice and installed security cameras at every door. I also avoid taxis entirely now. Ride-sharing apps may have their risks, but at least they're traceable. To this day, I can't help but wonder, was that even a real taxi driver, or was the van stolen? When I was 28, I took a trip to Denver, Colorado, to visit my cousin who had just gotten married. It was one of those whirlwind family getaways, 3 days filled with laughter, long dinners, and catching up with relatives I hadn't seen in years. I flew out on a Friday morning and was back on a plane late Monday night, heading home to Portland. My return flight was uneventful, but it landed close to midnight. By the time I'd collected my bag, navigated through the quiet airport, and made my way to the curb for ground transportation, it was nearly 12:45 a.m. I was exhausted and cranky, wanting nothing more than to fall into bed. I pulled out my phone to order a rideshare, but the app was glitching. After a few failed attempts, I gave up and decided to grab a taxi instead. A black SUV with a taxi sign on its roof pulled up. The driver rolled down the window and asked where I was heading. I told him my apartment address, and he quoted me $40 for the ride. It wasn't a great deal, but I was too tired to argue or wait for another option. The driver, a man in his late 40s or early 50s, stepped out to help me with my luggage. He was tall, with salt and pepper hair and a slight paunch. His face was friendly enough, but something about his overly enthusiastic demeanor put me on edge. He insisted on loading my bag into the trunk, despite my protests. The moment I climbed into the back seat, I noticed the interior felt off. The car was clean, but there was no partition or visible meter. The GPS on his phone was mounted on the dashboard, angled away from me. I tried to brush off my unease. Maybe he was just an independent driver, I thought. Once we were on the highway, I leaned back and tried to relax. The ride was supposed to take about 25 minutes with no traffic, and the roads were practically deserted at this hour. But within minutes, I noticed the driver watching me through the rearview mirror. At first, I thought it was my imagination, But the second time his gaze lingered. I knew I wasn't imagining it. "Long trip?" he asked, breaking the silence. "Not too bad," I replied curtly, hoping my short answer would end the conversation. He didn't take the hint. "Visiting family?" "Yes," I said, keeping my tone neutral. His next comment sent a chill down my spine. "Lucky family to have someone as beautiful as you come visit." I froze, unsure how to respond. It wasn't just the words, it was the way he said them, like he was testing the waters. I muttered a polite thanks, but my gut was screaming that something wasn't right. The questions kept coming. "What do you do for work? Do you live alone?" I lied, saying I had a roommate. He chuckled, the sound low and unsettling. "Roommates can't protect you like a boyfriend could," he said. At that moment, I regretted not lying about having a boyfriend. His tone was playful, but the context made it deeply unsettling. I stared out the window, counting the minutes until we'd reach my apartment. As we neared the turnoff to my neighborhood, I noticed he wasn't slowing down. "That's my exit," I said firmly. He didn't respond, driving right past it. "Hey, that was my exit," I said louder, sitting up in my seat. He waved me off. "Sorry, I'll turn around at the next one." My stomach knotted. I leaned forward, trying to see his GPS, but his phone was angled out of view. The next exit was coming up fast, and I wasn't about to let him miss it. "You need to take this exit," I said, almost shouting. This time he merged off the highway, but I noticed his knuckles tightening on the steering wheel. His silence was deafening. As we came to a red light, he turned to me. "You seem nervous. Don't worry, I'll get you home safe." The way he said it didn't reassure me. I pulled out my phone, pretending to text, and sent my location to my brother, adding, "This driver is creeping me out." My brother was notorious for staying up late, and sure enough, he replied almost instantly, telling me to call if I needed anything. The light turned green, but the driver didn't move. I had to remind him. "It's green," I said, my voice trembling. He started driving again, but something felt off. We were in my town now, but instead of taking the direct route, he was weaving through side streets. "Why aren't we on the main road?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Faster this way," he said, barely glancing back. I didn't buy it. My heart was pounding as I spotted a gas station up ahead with a brightly lit parking lot. As we neared, I made a snap decision. "I need you to pull over here," I said. He frowned. "Why?" "I just realized I left my keys at the airport." I lied. He didn't pull over. Instead, he kept driving, his grip on the wheel tightening. I didn't wait for an argument. As soon as we slowed for the next light, I grabbed my bag, opened the door, and jumped out. The driver shouted something, but I didn't stop to listen. I sprinted toward the gas station, my heart racing. Once inside, I told the clerk what had happened, and she immediately called the police. The driver didn't follow me, which felt like confirmation that his intentions hadn't been good. The police arrived quickly, and after explaining everything, they offered to drive me home. I hesitated at first, but agreed, still shaken. When I finally got inside my apartment, I locked every door and window, double-checking each one. I didn't feel safe, though. My mind kept replaying the driver's creepy questions and the way he had ignored my directions. I barely slept that night, and the next morning I called my landlord to ask about installing a security system. By the time I got home from work that evening, I had cameras set up at the front and back doors. The following night, something strange happened. I was sitting on the couch when I heard a soft knock at the door. My stomach flipped. I checked the peephole, but no one was there. I told myself it was probably just a prank or a delivery mix-up. Then, a few minutes later, there was another knock, louder this time. I stayed frozen in place, barely breathing. My phone buzzed with a notification from the front door camera. When I checked the footage, my blood ran cold. There, on the porch, was the driver from the night before. He wasn't holding anything or saying anything, just standing there, staring at the door. I called 911 immediately, whispering into the phone so he wouldn't hear me. When I looked back at the footage, he was gone. The police arrived within minutes, but there was no sign of him. The officer suggested I stay somewhere else for a few days, just to be safe. I packed a bag and headed to my brother's place, feeling a mix of relief and paranoia. To this day, I don't know what the driver's intentions were or how he found my apartment. I've since moved to a new city, but the memory of that night still haunts me. Now, I never take taxis, no matter how convenient they seem. Sometimes, the risk just isn't worth it.